Okay. Sorry for that delay. Databasing indigenous knowledge, some problems with Jorge Soberon from the Biodiversity Institute. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for being here. In the main building of the Museum of Natural History in Dyche Hall, there is this huge exhibit called the Panorama. It is, well, one of the most popular exhibits in the museum, and kids from all the state of Kansas and other parts of the country come to see it. It has a problem or several problems. Among them is that the message, there are implicit and explicit messages behind the panorama. And among the implicit messages, since there are no names, and there are 213 species of things in the panorama, and all the names are in Latin or in English, with a few in Spanish. So that means that the only languages that matter are the European languages, which I don't think it's fair. So there is a project now to add indigenous names to the panorama. And when we started doing that, some people said, well, why don't add indigenous knowledge as well? Well, adding indigenous knowledge is more than just adding the names. The first question one needs to ask is, what is indigenous knowledge? And this is not an easy question. There are technical problems in defining indigenous knowledge. There are conceptual problems. There are legal problems, and there are political and ethical problems. And I'm going to go over a few of these very quickly. And I'm going to begin with the simplest one, which is just add the names. This is all around the panorama, there are labels like this one with outlines of the species and the names in English and in Latin. And I am going to concentrate on this one, Juniperus. As I said, there are 213 species represented in the panorama, and they are all perfectly realistic, and many of them, all the animals are real animals, were real animals. If I go to the wiki and ask for the names of Juniperus scopulorum, what I get is, this is what I get. And all the names that are in the wiki are either in Latin or in English or in French. There is one French name. When I asked about indigenous names, I got, this is just a sample that I got from an anthropologist, 13 different ways of referring to the same species, which is called Juniperus scopulorum in Latin. There are 13 names depending on what culture you are discussing. So when we decide to add names, indigenous names to the species of the panorama, the first question is, in what language? From what culture? There are many cultures that are that knew about the same species and had different names, and the names mean something normally. And there are also associated narratives and other things, which I am going to discuss. So nevertheless, we started because we had to start somehow. And the way we started was by discussing first at what time there were indigenous peoples in what parts of the country. But you have to define the time because they were moving for all sorts of reasons, including the expansion of the Western peoples to the West. But before that, they were moving. So at what time? And we started by doing a practical thing. Let's use the treaties. The treaties define at a certain period of time who was living where. And immediately we got, that is an arbitrary decision, and that decision is not accepted by everybody the same way. There are certain cultures that would not accept that as a fair description of where they were using the land. But we started because there was no other way. We had to do something. The other problem is that the treaties are all used using the exonyms. Every single people in the world has the names they refer to themselves and the names by whom they are referred to by others. And normally the one you refer to yourself is very nice, and normally the other is very derogatory. So we had to use the exonyms, which is, again, far from ideal. And if we do that, these are the treatises between 1850 and 900 in the United States, and we could intersect that with biomes that are depicted in the panorama and get what tribes were in what part of the country at that period of time. And then we get how many treatises. There are hundreds of treatises, hundreds. And from that, we could start getting a little bit of a handle on the names. And then we have a table with names for plants, and in the different languages, you see that different plants may have the same different language, different names, the same species of plant. So these are technical problems. We are still dealing with them, but this is just the names. What about the extra things, the knowledge? What is knowledge? And then we get into conceptual problems, because knowledge is a category of the Western philosophy way of thinking. And it's very different from in different cultures. There are ways to define knowledge that are individual or the community knowledge, which these are different. Ours is individual. There are ways of defining knowledge when you define something using words, and this is our way, or where you perform, you do something, and that is knowledge too in other cultures. There are ways of transmitting knowledge, which is transmitted by doing, that is called tacit knowledge, or by reading a book or a paper. Well, there are all sorts of different ways of using the term knowledge, which are, you cannot just assume that everybody shares our way of defining knowledge. And besides, our ideology, the ideology of modern science, assumes that there is a single correct knowledge, but that's not the case in every culture. It may be that there are several valid knowledges about the same thing that are not necessarily coincident. This is a way of imagining how knowledge is structured by a number of people. Victor Toledo, with antecedents by many people, and this is knowledge is a combination of three things. The actual corpus of knowledge, like for instance, this plant, if you eat it, you are going to die, or if you eat it, you are going to be fed. This is the corpus of knowledge. There is also the practice. Why are you using something for? Are you selling it in our culture, or are you using it for medicine, or for food, or for ceremonies? What for? That's a different part of the thing. And finally, the corpus, which is the narrative, the perspective, the way you express this and this. And that corpus normally is very different in indigenous knowledge than in our knowledge, because it's normally expressed in terms of stories, mythology, legends. It's a spiritual, religious, things like that. So this combination of the three things is what, according to this author, means to be, indigenous knowledge. Now, if you go and ask indigenous peoples, for instance, this one, well, knowledge is expressed as law, country, language, ceremony, and skin. you need to be a member of that group in order to understand that. But that's the way they themselves think about what they know. It's not exactly what we think they know, because for all the reasons I have mentioned before. There are also legal problems. In most of the world, the United States is one of the 3 or 4 exceptions, but in most of the world, the Convention on Biological Diversity is law. And in that convention, there is an article, Article 8J, which defines this. In order to access indigenous knowledge, you need to have the prior informed consent of the tribe. And that is law in most countries in the world, not here, but it is in most countries of the world. So if I am going to database something, I really would need to ask permission first. And that's something that you cannot just take for granted or assume that is going to be the case. And increasingly, the White House and the Department of Interior are taking this thing seriously. And there are now guidance, which are not law, but they are guidelines, on how to access indigenous knowledge if you are a member of the Department of the Interior, for instance. And there are also political problems, because knowledge is something related to power and inequalities. And many indigenous groups resent that their knowledge is being extracted and compiled in books and then used from outside their cultures. It's something that is resented by many people. And this is a quote by a Cree representative from Canada, which basically says that this is reinforcing Western cultural biases. You don't want to be data-based. Besides, there are many indigenous knowledges. There's not a single indigenous knowledge. There are many about the same things. And increasingly, indigenous peoples are recognized by systems of nation states. That is happening in many parts of the world. Here, indeed, in Canada, in many other parts. So you need to consider all these political aspects when you are trying to database indigenous knowledge. Finally, there are ethical issues. The very idea of an archive of knowledge has ethical connotations. Is it right to do it without asking, without involving, without considering all these subtleties about whether that is a religious knowledge or something that is expressed by a ceremony rather than by a statement in words? And besides, indigenous knowledge sometimes are not public because of religious, ceremonial, clannish reasons, gender reasons. In many Aboriginal tribes, for instance, in Australia, the knowledge that women have is different from the knowledge that men have. It's different, and it's kept under control of the different representatives. So you cannot just get it and, well, I mean, you can, but one shouldn't just get it and publish it in a book or in a database. There have been attempts to database indigenous knowledge. For instance, this is a database of 4,000 medicinal plants of Mexico. It's publicly available. It was compiled by scientists and it's for scientists. I would be very surprised if many indigenous scholars or doctors would use this database. And the issue of databasing indigenous knowledge is being debated. In fact, there is now a set of guidelines called CARE that basically state that one has to be very careful when one database indigenous knowledge by asking the people first and considering that much of the knowledge may not be made publicly available and things like that. So adding indigenous knowledge to databases, which is something very popular, and if you are in this field, you will hear it expressed oftentimes, hey, why don't we add indigenous knowledge? I have been in the receiving part of that kind of advice often. Well, there are many technical and fundamental problems, ethical, political, conceptual. Solving these issues is work in progress. I would not be so eager to start digitizing indigenous knowledge without at least having full participation of whomever is involved. That is, I believe, the most important thing. Well, thank you very much to everybody that has been helping in this project. I hope Kat Doherty, which is sitting there, it's here. I'm not sure. Maybe I didn't put you there, Kat. Sorry, but this has been a fascinating enterprise, trying to understand what is the meaning of knowing from different perspectives, from different peoples. And I've been just scratching the surface. Any questions or comments that you may have? I would like to do my best to answer. Thank you. Okay.
How did you get across the divide from the people of the data side who were trying to deal with the issues and the public-facing side, the museum that might not be the same mindset?
Excuse me, the people online won't be able to hear you. I'm sorry.
The question is how you link the two different perspectives, the databasing people and the museum people, right? I think that the only way is by sitting down together and discussing the issues. It's difficult because, among other things, because it's as a Western scientist, I tend to share the worldview of knowledge with a computer scientist and not with someone from a Maya community. So I would be very easily getting into all sorts of assumptions and assumptions that you take for granted with an engineer. I think that the only way is by sitting down with all the interested parties and discussing the issues together and trying to find some sort of compromise. Yes.
So I was thinking about including people from different cultures. Let's say Western science, like so I have the question. So the first one would be like, how are you like including people from different communities into what we do in biodiversity data science? For example, like including them in papers, because I think at the end it's like we do this work and that kind of like gives us a status in academia, and we get promotions and we make a living of it. But how does this help the communities themselves? Is there any other solution, like maybe like even like trying to like I don't know, like including them in like work positions or something like that?
I should think that this case by case, and every case is going to be different. One has to start with a position of respect. You listen, and it takes time to communicate because the worldviews that we have, our worldview is completely different from the worldview of other people's. What is good, what is bad, what is knowledge, what is not knowledge, everything is different. So you need to spend the time listening and being listened to and developing some sort of common language. For instance, for us, it's very important to publish in a paper or in a book. For an indigenous scholar, it may be completely irrelevant. Perhaps she doesn't care at all about that. So sit down and talk and listen and be respectful, and eventually there's going to be an understanding. I have seen many cases where, given the time and the effort, eventually there is a common understanding. We are all humans, and we, despite the fact that we may differ in worldviews, we share very deep things together. So I think that's the answer. And I have been working in Mexico with Maya communities, for instance, and after 1 or 2 years, or Zapotec communities, after 1 or 2 years of continuous, okay, we agree on this and this and this, we disagree on this and that and that, and that is, and from that you proceed. And sometimes you need to, what is useful for a community, they will tell you. It's not what you think is going to be useful, it's what they tell you it's useful. And then I have, very briefly, if I have still 10 seconds, I was once involved in a negotiation with Wambisu in Colombia, and these Wambisu were willing to share their native knowledge about medicinal plants in and what they wanted in as payment was a clinic, a medical clinic in their tropical rainforest. That was really, really, really fascinating. There was a trade-off between our medicinal knowledge and your medicinal knowledge, and we want both. Not just one versus the other, but both. And they decided what they wanted. And I believe they got it, but I don't remember. So it's case by case.